Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Wellstead. Today we're going to be talking about invasive species, what they are and why they're bad for an ecosystem. So this can be quite an interesting video, there's going to be quite a bit of science in it, so stay tuned to find out more. Okay, so I'm currently up here at the top of my woodland, and this whole area is swamped with rhododendrons and cherry laurel, which are both invasive species that we're working on removing here in our woodland. But in order to understand why we're doing that, we first have to ask the question, what is an invasive species? Now, the ecological definition of what constitutes an invasive species varies quite a lot. There's no real set definition of what an invasive species is. However, the correct term to describe an invasive species is invasive non-native species, so INNS for short. Essentially, an invasive species is either a plant or an animal or any organism that enters an environment and is not initially from that environment, and then its presence there causes some kind of disturbance in the overall balance of that ecosystem. But we need to draw a distinction between an invasive species and a non-native species, because not every non-native species is invasive. For example, here in England, many people think that the sycamore tree is a native species. In fact, we had the famous sycamore tree at Hadrian's Wall up north that was illegally cut down a couple of years ago, and there was, mass outrage caused by this illegal felling of this beautiful and historic tree. And so in England, the sycamore has become something of like a national symbol, but in fact the sycamore is a non-native species. It doesn't originate from the British Isles. It has been introduced by humans and has since naturalized in the ecosystem. So that means it's not an invasive species, although it's not native, it's fitting quite well with the ecosystem, and so it's just sort of very smoothly integrated into the ecosystem. So now it is a species of the British Isles, and as far as most people are concerned, it might as well be a native species here. So where an invasive non-native species differs from that, it hasn't integrated well into the ecosystem. So these rhododendrons, for example, that I'm surrounded by, rhododendrons, I believe, originally come from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and I believe all the way into the Himalayas. And so rhododendrons, like other non-native species, were actually introduced to the British Isles back in the Victorian times. Now, of course, the Victorians were known for their fascination with exotic plants. And so, you have the image of the Victorian explorer with the cool sort of tan hat going off to Africa or Asia or South America. And they would often bring these exotic plants back to England to sell to rich aristocrats and noble families to display it in their manor houses and things like that as sort of a status symbol. Rhododendrons became a popular garden plant to use as garden edging and trees to have in your garden. And that trend has sort of continued to this day. The problem is, where rhododendrons come from sort of subtropical and tropical environments in Asia, very hot and humid environments. And so when they come here to the British Isles where, we don't really get a whole lot of hot weather, so because the rhododendrons lack the intense heat and humidity that they need to thrive, then they suck the soil dry of as many nutrients and minerals as they can. And so once you've removed rhododendrons, the soil can actually remain barren for up to 7 to 10 years after you've removed it, because it's just degraded the soil so much. This is an area here that we have recently cleared rhododendrons from. This whole area here to where these cut rhododendrons are, and that pile over there, this was all rhododendron about 2 months back. You can see how dry and barren and acidic the soil is here. There's no sign of native flora regeneration whatsoever, except for this bramble here. And it's also why they spread so rampantly like this. So whereas what you would call a healthy tree, like these native birch trees, for example, or this beech tree above me here. A healthy tree would focus on putting most of its energy into growing a dense and healthy and thick trunk, like this tree here. This one is huge. However, rhododendron, what makes them an invasive species is they spread as rapidly as they can to compensate for that lack of sunlight. They send suckers out through the soil, so they grow up in one shoot, and it'll be several trunks coming out of the same cluster. And then you'll find a shoot going under the soil and then popping up somewhere else. And then that will go out and it will spread. So it's a clonal tree. It clones itself to spread as much as possible. And that's when you get this issue here of rhododendrons completely swamping a native landscape like this. These trees are being swamped by these rhododendrons. Down here, I've actually cleared a path through the rhododendrons so that we have better access through my woodland. And these birch trees here, there's several of them, were completely swamped, maybe about 9 feet up their trunks by the rhododendrons. And so you get this issue where rhododendrons have either been planted somewhere like a woodland, either as a boundary to, provide privacy or security on land, on a property, or they've somehow escaped and they've spread rampantly here. And this is actually a very common problem in British nature at the moment. Rhododendrons are just swamping natural landscapes. And so now the other issue that you get is this. This is a tree that I cut down probably about 4 months ago, I think. And this was just the trunk. You can't even see it now. So what the tree has done is it's survived. I don't know if you can't quite see the fallen tree there, but it's just there. But this small section of the trunk that was left has now resprouted with as many leaves as it possibly can. Of course, any tree is known to do this. If you cut a tree, if it survives, as the sycamore gap tree that I was talking about a minute ago, the tree has been felled, but the stump is still alive, so it's now reshooting little branches out the sides with leaves on it to continue producing energy. So in terms of removing invasive species, you really need to make sure you've got the roots out, and with rhododendrons especially, get the suckers out that they send out to then produce another plant. Unless you were to use something like glyphosate, which was actually advised to me by an ecologist that I reached out to. They recommended injecting glyphosate into the trunk of the tree, and that would kill the tree. However, because we have all these beautiful birch trees and beech trees, and there's actually an oak tree right next to where I've put the camera there, I was a little bit concerned about the glyphosate leaching into the soil through the roots of the rhododendron and then potentially harming the other trees around. Hey everyone, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video so far, and I'd like to announce that the Wellstead is now live on Patreon. So if you want to support our work here directly, then consider subscribing to us on Patreon. Subscription starts at £5 a month, and 100% of donations go back to our work here, whether that's funding a new fence or new tools or planting new trees, anything like that. 100% of subscriptions go back into our work here. So if you want to help support the channel directly, then please consider heading over there and donating. And with that said, let's get back to the video. And so how do we determine what is a native species and what is a non-native species, or perhaps an invasive species? Well, just the same with invasive species. The definition for a native species varies depending on the source. Typically, a native species is one that has been present in the ecosystem for, I think some say about 600 years, some say up to 6,000 years. And so essentially it means that it's a species that has been in the ecosystem for so long that it is an integral part of that ecosystem. And so why do we remove invasive species? Wild trees like rhododendrons and cherry laurel here do provide habitats for certain insects and birds. I often see big nasty spiders crawling on the leaves here, and I always see birds flying in and out of the branches. And of course they also provide shelter for deer. The rhododendrons that I've cut down up there was actually where a lot of roe deer were sleeping. The negative effects they have on the ecosystem far outweigh any positive benefit they might have to a select few species. For example, roe deer, although they were sleeping in amongst the rhododendrons up there, they can just as easily move and find a different sheltered area to sleep in. Same with birds, there's obviously plenty of trees around everywhere, and so a bird's really not going to be disturbed too much if you cut down rhododendron or cherry laurel. And so the benefit of removing the species, as I said, it far outweighs any sort of damage you might be doing to native species who use that particular plant or tree as its habitat. I saw a comment quite recently online on a video touching on this, where somebody said, why would you remove an invasive species? Surely it is increasing the biodiversity of a habitat. And I was sitting there thinking about it, and I realized there needs to be a distinction made between biodiversity and what we might call biovariety, which is a term I've made up to illustrate this point. And so, if we're going to make a distinction between biodiversity and biovariety, then what we're talking about is biovariety is the variety, the number of different species that might be present in an environment. So for example, you could say a zoo, an animal zoo has, or like an arboretum or a Victorian garden has a high variety of species. However, those species aren't going to be interacting. There aren't going to be these dynamic processes that uphold and create the very environment they live in. And they're not going to have this reciprocal feedback of interactions with their environment that also sustain them. Whereas biodiversity is where you have lots of different species, but they're all interwoven, interdependent, and interacting with each other to sustain each other. Whether that's conflict or cooperation, they're still sustaining each other. And you have the biotic components and the abiotic components of that environment, so the living species and the conditions of the physical environment, also interacting and upholding each other. Imagine you have an orchestra. Now, I'm not a musician by any means, but imagine that you have an orchestra with everyone playing, and they're all playing, or as a choir singing or something like that, and they're all singing or playing to the same note. And so when they sing or they play, it just sounds beautiful. It's all harmonious sound, and the different instruments or the different tones of voice or whatever, they all complement each other to make this beautiful sound. And now imagine that just one person or one musician in that orchestra plays the wrong note, or their instrument is out of tune. Even if 99 out of 100 people in that orchestra are playing the right tune, the right notes, then that one person who is out of tune will throw off the whole thing. You'll be able to notice it. Even if you sat at the back of the theatre, you'll be able to notice it, and it would just sound very off. And so that's how I would describe an invasive species, and that's why we have to remove them. Because an invasive species can come into a landscape and completely alter the balance of that landscape, even if it's just one invasive species, which is very rarely the case, because where you have one, then that will upset the balance, and then that will give way for more invasive species to come into the ecosystem. But if we imagine an ecosystem like an orchestra, then you have all these dynamic components working together, interacting and upholding the harmony of the whole. And then you have one thing that can come in and be out of tune. And that will upset the equilibrium of the entire ecosystem. And so, although on the surface, our work here removing these cherry laurels might seem like deforestation, and it might seem unethical and contradictory to what we're trying to do here, our primary goal at the moment, at this stage of the Wellstead, is to restore the woodland to its natural ecological balance, and that includes removing invasive species, invasive trees especially, like rhododendrons and cherry laurels. And so another thing to consider, especially when talking about forest ecology and an invasive species in an area like this, a British woodland, in the soil there is a type of fungus called mycorrhizal fungus. It's not just one type of fungus, it's like a category of different fungi. It's a type of fungus that will interact with trees, especially in a symbiotic relationship where they penetrate into the root systems of the trees in exchange for the sugars and the carbohydrates that the tree produces from sunlight. And in return, the mycorrhizal fungus will provide carbon and different minerals to the roots of the tree. But in terms of invasive trees like these cherry laurels here, they are most likely not connected to the mycorrhizal network underground, and so in a sense they're going to be even more under stress because they're in an isolated ecosystem. So to answer that question, you know, why would you remove an invasive species? Surely it just contributes to the overall biodiversity of that habitat or environment. Well, I think you need to invent a new term, biovariety. And so the number of different species you have in a given area does not necessarily equal the integrity of that ecosystem. Like I said, a zoo, you have lots of different animals living together from all around the world, but they're not interacting at all. And most of the time, their environments that they live in are all fake. So you can't call that a rich ecosystem, but it has 200 or 300 different species of animal in it. And so biodiversity is not just the number of species in a habitat, but the interactions between those species and the harmonious balance that exists between all those species, regardless of how many are in there. And so the issue of invasive species is just one of many factors contributing to the environmental crisis and the mass ecological decline that we're seeing all over the world today. You know, from climate change, which is inextricably linked to ecological integrity in the world. As I said, biotic and abiotic forces, they work together in harmony. But understanding the issue of invasive species is particularly useful to us because we can really learn something from it. The two examples I've used today of rhododendrons and cherry laurel. You can imagine if you put yourself in their roots, this is a tree that is in an environment that it sees as hostile to itself and it sees as foreign. And so we can question our own attitude towards the world. Do we see the whole world around us as something that is foreign to us and that we are foreign to? And therefore, does that inform the way we react and interact with the world around us? And so are humans an invasive species? Because we are by no means excluded from the principles of ecology in the world. We are perhaps the most influential keystone species on the planet. The difference is, though, as I've explained in previous videos, is that we have the consciousness, the self-consciousness, and the intelligence to recognize that perhaps the way we interact with the world around us isn't so sustainable and could be contributing to the degradation of the natural world. And so I don't want to end this video on a bummer, but I'm just trying to say that perhaps we do need to be more conscious of the way we interact with the world around us and look at a species like rhododendron, cherry laurel, or any other invasive species. And so that's one thing that understanding invasive species can teach us, also from a more pragmatic and day-to-day perspective. If you have something like cherry laurels or any species that you know is not from here, growing in your garden or something, by all means, create the environment you want for yourself. Rhododendrons are a beautiful tree, and that's why a lot of people don't realize that they are so invasive. In fact, there's an area not too far from here called Rhododendron Mile, because there is this road going through a coniferous plantation, which is already an ecological disaster. But in between all those coniferous trees is just, you cannot get an inch into the undergrowth because it's so dense with rhododendron and ferns and brambles in the ground, and it's a complete ecological disaster. And so we now see rhododendrons growing everywhere, and we think they're a beautiful tree, and yes, they do have beautiful flowers. But sometimes it's important to remind ourselves, actually, they're an invasive species, and should they be growing that much everywhere? Should there not be more variety, I guess? But I think it's important to understand, and especially if you're getting into ecology or if you just want to learn a little bit more about the world around you, then invasive species are any non-native species that comes into an environment and upsets the balance of that ecosystem in one way or another through simply their presence there. Thank you everyone for watching. if you like these kinds of videos, then I'll be doing definitely more sort of educational videos on ecology and forestry practices and things like that. I also do a lot of vlogs on my channel, keeping track of our progress building the farm and restoring the woodland overall. And I do various other kinds of videos. So if that's of interest to you, then please consider hitting subscribe. And if you like this video, give it a like, share it with anyone else you think might find it interesting. Until the next time, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video at the Wellstead. Hello everyone, thank you for making it to the end of this video. If you're still watching, I want to start doing something new at the ends of my videos. I'm going to start doing book reviews for about 3 to 5 minutes at the end of each video. Not every video, but if I'm doing like a vlog, then I think it'd be nice to just have a little section at the end that I can review a book related to perhaps something that we were talking about in the video, or maybe something else entirely. I've got loads and loads of books to get through, so we'll be starting with sort of books about ecology and nature writing and things like that. So with that said, today we're going to be reviewing Living Planet by David Attenborough. I think it's a great introductory book to ecology. Obviously, David Attenborough is renowned for his work in communicating the science of ecology and nature conservation through his documentaries. The experience of reading this book is equivalent, although slower, to the experience of watching one of his documentaries. He's really been able to translate his style of storytelling well into written work, and so his words are just as lucid and vivid as his documentary images are. So this is called Living Planet, The Web of Life on Earth. I believe it might also be published under a different name or two, because I know there's one called Life on Earth, and I believe there's another name it might go by. I'm not sure if they're different books or if they're the same book published perhaps in different editions. I don't know, but this is the one I have. The blurb reads, first it's got a quote by Sir David Attenborough. It says, "It seems to me that the natural world is the greatest source of excitement, the greatest source of visual beauty, the greatest source of intellectual interest. It is the greatest source of so much in life that makes life worth living." And then the blurb goes on to read, "Living Planet is David Attenborough's classic exploration of the web of life on Earth. Covering each of the 12 major habitats, this journey takes us to all 4 corners of the world, to the lowest point in the ocean and to the highest point in the mountains and the air above." Attenborough explains how, in all these places, the living organisms found there live in intricate relationships with each other, vital for their survival and vital for life on Earth. The book itself has 12 chapters, which, as it said on the back, it explores the 12 major habitats on the Earth. And then the last chapter is very interesting. He puts a really unique twist on this book. So whereas he covers, obviously, the major wilderness areas of the world, the last chapter is called New Worlds. And in that chapter, he explores wildlife in urban areas and how certain wildlife, like foxes, pigeons, and these sorts of animals, have adapted to living in human environments and scavenging from our waste products. Now, one thing I love about this book, and another thing that makes it so accessible to any level of reader, is that Sir David Attenborough, in his beautiful way of communicating these facts, has included photography in the book. And so you can see towards the middle of his book, after sort of every other chapter, he will have these beautiful photographs here that illustrate the concepts and the environments that he was talking about in those previous chapters. And being such an enthusiastic nature and wildlife photographer myself, this is just such a beautiful addition to this book. I think if it was all writing, then it wouldn't be, as I keep saying, it wouldn't be as accessible to such a wide reader base. But with these just gorgeous photographs in here, you know, really makes it feel real, because you're not just reading words on a page and creating a mental construct of it. You're seeing the exact things he was talking about. I mean, just look at some of these photos in here. And so, Sir David Attenborough's Living Planet, a fantastic read if you're just getting into nature writing, or if you want to learn more about ecology. It doesn't go too deep into the science, Instead, what it gives you is real life, vivid examples of these ecological principles. If you just want to learn something beautiful about the natural world, who better than Sir David Attenborough to write a book going over just random examples of these different cases of interdependence and species interaction in the natural world. So overall, I'd give this book probably an 8 out of 10 for its accessibility. And even if you are more knowledgeable on ecological science or, nature conservation or anything like that, this is still just such a beautiful book to read. In fact, it sort of takes you out of your head a bit. If you're getting lost in perhaps climate science or environmental sciences, this is a great book to just bring you back to the real world and make you realize if you don't have the field experience, then these aren't just scientific concepts. These are real life interactions happening all around us all the time. And Sir David Attenborough just illustrates a few of those examples so wonderfully in this book here. That's Living Planet by Sir David Attenborough. You can probably pick it up on Amazon or at your local bookstore. Definitely worth a read. And if you're interested in more nature writing, then stay tuned on the channel because I'll be reviewing more books in the future. That's it for this review. Thanks for watching and goodbye.